But our next guest says the province needs to step up its tax regime so that those who live in Ontario will benefit from living in the nation's most valuable minerals producer. Joining us now, Erin Weir, economist at the United Steelworkers. It's great to see you again, Erin.
Well, great to be here.
It's interesting. I mean, Ontario is the biggest province by mining output.
Well, that's right. There's this kind of Canadian regional narrative of the resource-rich West versus the resource-poor Ontario. And while it's true that Ontario doesn't have much of an oil and gas industry, it actually has the highest value of mineral production of any province. As you mentioned, last week's provincial budget put the number at nearly $11 billion last year.
You have numbers for 2010, which I think are the most recent. You get a breakdown. You say there was $8 billion in 2010, $2 billion of gold, $1 billion of copper, $1 billion of nickel. So that's $4 billion. What were the other $4 billion?
Sure. Well, there's about $1 billion of various other metals, and then there's about $3 billion of non-metallic minerals. So that would include diamonds, but it would also include a lot of mundane things that come out of quarries, like salt and sand and gravel and cement. But all of that adds up.
You crunch the numbers and you say, well, let's say it was $11 billion last year. Let's call it around $10 billion, if that's okay.
Sure.
So how much is the province taking in specific mining taxes and royalties?
Well, that's actually a really good question, because one of the challenges here is that the Ontario budget is not very transparent about its resource revenues. It kind of lumps the Ontario mining tax into this category called other taxes.
Handy.
Yeah, and then, you've also got the separate royalty for diamonds, and the fees from quarries are sort of lumped into this line called royalties, which also includes, water and stumpage fees. So it's actually hard to tell how much money the province is getting. But this last budget did disclose that for the 2010-11 fiscal year, so not the last fiscal year, but the one before, Ontario collected mining tax revenue of $140 million. And so if you add to that probably what the province got in diamond royalties and revenues from quarries, you're up to, let's say, $200 million. So out of the $10 billion base you're talking about, that's a 2% rate of return.
2%, and these minerals belong to the people of Ontario.
Well, that's right. We're talking about Crown-owned resources here that belong to the people of the province. So, I think we should be able to get a bit more than 2% of the value of those commodities.
I'm guessing it's hard to do comparisons with other provinces, but can you take a shot at it? I mean, how does Ontario compare?
Yeah, I mean, Ontario is sort of on the low end of other provinces if you just compare royalty revenues to the value of minerals extracted. I actually think a lot of other provinces are also sort of collecting too little revenue from their resource sectors, so that's maybe the wrong base of comparison. But, I mean, really, ultimately, what you want to look at is not just the gross value of production, but the profits derived from these resources. So it's actually important to look at the specific commodities and the specific mines and their cost structures, and I suppose that's why the provincial budget is calling for a review of Ontario's mining sector.
Look at that table. I mean, so we're about the same as Saskatchewan, but they get vastly more in revenue, apparently.
Well, that's right, and partly what that reflects is that Saskatchewan has these super profitable potash mines, so if you look at the royalties from those as a percentage of just the gross values of sales, it looks like a higher royalty rate. I mean, I've actually argued in other forums that Saskatchewan is collecting far less potash royalty revenue than it could.
We've heard a lot of observers saying the revenue is derisory compared to the province.
Yeah, so I wouldn't put Saskatchewan forward as some kind of high watermark, but it does sort of underscore just how badly Ontario is doing and how weak Ontario's resource return is.
Of course, the resource producers like to say, oh, we pay all these corporate taxes, but everybody pays taxes, so what's new there?
Well, that's exactly it, and an interesting point on that for Ontario is it's now the only Canadian jurisdiction, either federally or provincially, that still provides this resource allowance where resource companies get to deduct 25% of their profits before they even pay provincial corporate income tax.
Is that unique to resource companies?
It is indeed, and it's one of these measures that was originally sort of put in place to compensate for provincial royalties when they used to be higher, but now it's basically just amounts to another kind of giveaway to the resource sector. So even on the corporate income tax front, Ontario is the lowest of all the Canadian provinces and territories.
So you gave us a figure there of $200 million, I think, in special royalties and mineral taxes. Was that for last year, Erin?
That would be for the 2010-11 fiscal year. So that would be sort of the last year for which the provincial budget has given us any disclosure on the amount of revenue the province was collecting. And I think, probably in that fiscal year, about $9 billion worth of minerals were extracted from Ontario's mines and quarries. So you're still talking about a 2% return.
2% of their total revenue. Of course, they'll say, well, if you raise taxes, we're off to Burkina Faso. Do you buy that?
No, I don't buy that, because Ontario has lots of advantages relative to a country like Burkina Faso: better infrastructure, a better educated workforce, closer to markets for these commodities. And, in a lot of cases, Ontario actually has uniquely rich reserves. I mean, you look at the amount of nickel around Sudbury. I mean, there's not a lot of other places in the world where you're going to find that kind of resource base.
It's a treasure chest.
It absolutely is. And now we're talking about developing the Ring of Fire. So, I mean, I think there's actually a lot of potential here for the province to collect more revenue from its publicly owned minerals.
Thank you so much, Erin.
Oh, well, thanks for having me.
Erin Weir is an economist at the United Steel Workers.